everybody. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Michael Bryant. Thanks for joining me for the next couple of hours. Joining me now, I'm very excited to say, is Marni Jo Snyder. Happy to have you along again today. Nice to see you. How are you?
Thank you. Good. Thanks for having me.
You bet. You know, this case has a lot of elements to it. A lot of, the motive question is a huge issue here because perhaps the person with the greatest motive, the father who just lost custody of his son to his ex-wife of 3 years, might be the guy to look at. But that's not quite what the prosecution thinks. How important is that to convey to the jury exactly why you're not looking at dad and how the current defendant is the guy?
I mean, it is pretty important. So you don't have to prove motive. It's not one of the elements of the crime here. But certainly that's how they're going to make out an ID if they don't have a witness that saw the murder. So it's an incredibly important circumstantial evidence to who they point to and who they can convict of this crime. So, I mean, it's incredibly important.
Yeah, this is a case in which it's almost, there's a missing piece somewhere. If the friend, the defendant, David Russell Holbrook, who is a friend of the family prior to the divorce, and more importantly, Brian Howard's friend after the divorce, there's no connection between those two other than their friendship. We don't see any evidence of a conspiracy, at least not yet. But some common sense, and jurors like to tussle with the common sense, it would say, well, if Brian Howard is that upset about losing custody of his son and his buddy David Russell wants to help out, maybe that's going to connect everything we need to convince this jury. What do you think?
I think that's a little bit of a hard leap to take. So they really have to present as much as they can about the closeness of their friendship, why the motive of actually the dad would have been that his life was devastated by losing his son, which I think is obvious, but I think they really need to flesh that out because you don't see a lot of friends, kill someone for that friendship. Usually there's money exchange, some sort of favor, some sort of love interest. And so I think to just say my friend did me a favor and killed this woman, I think it's going to be a hard leap for the jury to take. So they're really going to have to hammer that relationship in. Yeah,
I get that. And, when we hear some of this testimony, we're going to hear right now something very important from Janice Burke. This is the divorce attorney for Melissa Howard, and her testimony was a battle. I mean, just getting this into court was a battle because of the hearsay issues, and Marni Jo and I are going to talk about hearsay and double hearsay and multiple hearsay when we come back from the other side of this testimony. This is critical stuff about the phone call that took place between Melissa Howard and her attorney just after a visit by David Russell Holbrook, the ex-husband's friend, that definitely shook up Melissa Howard. Let's listen now to her attorney recounting that.
So that night when you spoke with her, what did she tell you was the reason that she was so upset?
The first thing that she said to me was, I knew this would happen. And I asked her, what did she mean by that? And she said that Brian sent one of his men over to scare me. And I asked who it was because, I asked who it was, and she told me who it was.
How did she identify the person that had done this?
Well, right after she had answered the phone, she said he just left. And then she said, I knew he would do this. I had made an assumption that it was Brian. That's why I said, who was it? And she said that it was Russell.
Okay. Did you inquire who Russell was referring to?
I already knew who Russell was based on our prior conversations. However, I did ask her to specify exactly who she was talking about.
Did she?
She did.
And what did she say?
She used his full name. She said David Russell. Did
she say what Russell told her during the course of the visit? I mean, why? How does that relate to what was going on in Melissa Howard's life?
That was the 4th of January, and beginning on January the 6th is when Taylor was supposed to start living with her on a primary basis. And she told me that what Russell told her was, you need to let that boy be with his father, and you need to let this go. So I took that to mean, of course, in 2 days, Taylor needed to stay with his dad as opposed to going to live with him.
Okay, so we've got some hearsay issues here, and Marni Jo Snyder, who's with me, they dealt with that before this witness even got to take the stand in the Holbrook case. We talk about excited utterances, and it means something different in federal court versus state to state. There's a kind of a fluid definition, but generally it means a statement that's made under the circumstances that would give it credibility. It doesn't give the person time to reflect, to make things up, to lie. So in this case, we have a phone call from the ultimate victim to her attorney, apparently upset that a friend of her husband, who she says threatened her, has just left the home. First, let me get your impressions on whether this is really a stretch to the excited utterance and whether you think it should have come in.
I was a little bit surprised that it came in, because we have this right, you know, what you're talking about is the urgency of it, right? It's right butted up against something that makes the person excited or upset or something like that. And so I kind of saw that when she was saying, well, he just left a second ago, and this is who it is. But I find it odd that it came in, because it's a phone call with her attorney, and she's probably telling her attorney so that they can prepare for court for this custody battle. So I was a little bit surprised that it came in, because we don't want to let things in where someone has time to think about them, to fabricate or to exaggerate for their own interests. And she's talking to her own attorney, who's going to be representing her further, you would think, in this custody battle. Thought it was strange that it came in.
And now, if you look at it in retrospect, you know, it's kind of eerie that nonetheless her concern for David Russell Holbrook may or may not have ended up in her death 3 days later. So she had some sort of prescience, or she really truly was that upset. But you're right, I agree with you. I was surprised it came in. There was also a secondary hearsay issue, because she was talking about, the attorney was talking about, not just what Melissa said, but what Melissa heard somebody else say, David Holbrook. So it was double hearsay, and we could get into all of that at some point in the future in the Law&Crime classroom here. But let's take a break for now. We'll come back. We'll get more backup information and kind of catch up on the Holbrook case when we come back to the Law&Crime Network. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Law&Crime Network. I'm here with Marni Jo Snyder. We're going to talk more about this Holbrook case out of Florida. They are in a not in front of the jury battle going on down there about some emails back and forth between the defense and the prosecution. Apparently prosecution saying whatever the defense sent them, they should have sent them much sooner than they did. So, angry judge, not good. And they're battling it out outside the presence of the jury. As soon as they get back at it in front of the jury, we'll get those guys to you. So we're catching up on Florida versus Holbrook. This is a case, remember, in which the mother of three had just gotten custody of the son. We heard from the son a couple of minutes ago. And so when a victim of this kind dies, the cops are always going to look at the inner circle, the boyfriend, the husband. They looked at the husband, Brian Howard. They looked at him closely. They found that he had just what they felt was the perfect alibi, maybe too perfect. Let's listen to testimony from the trial that supports his alibi that he was just at a party that night.
Who was at this particular dinner?
Oh, gosh.
As many as you can remember.
Let's see. We had myself, Brian, my son, Skylar, Taylor, Nicole, Jared, Robbie and Bobby Davis, their daughter, Erin, and another friend of my son, school friend. Let's see, JT, and I can't remember. There was 15 of us.
I think you got 10 out of the 15. That's
okay.
We'll go with that. What time did you leave Azteca that night?
I don't recall. When I got interviewed, they asked me, and I didn't know. I said, look at the receipt. I paid by a debit. And so they called me a liar because the debit card said a different time, but their time was different on the machine.
When you left Azteca, where did you go?
I drove to drop Skylar, which was Brian Howard's daughter, to a friend's to spend the night. And then we ended up going back to Beacons Bend to the house.
Who is we?
Brian and I.
Was Brian with you when you dropped Skylar off at her friend's house?
Yes, sir.
Where did your son Tyler go?
He rode with some friends of his, Nicole and Jared, to say goodbye to Nicole's family. They were all friends.
And where did Brian's son Taylor go?
Taylor rode home with Allison.
Who is Allison?
Allison Holbrook. That was Russell's wife at the time.
What time did you arrive home?
I don't know.
Did you stop anywhere on the way?
No.
Was anyone else already there when you arrived?
Allison and Taylor was there.
Did anyone else from the dinner ultimately end up at your house?
Yes, sir.
Who was that?
Nicole, Jared, my son, and then he had another friend that didn't come to eat with us, but he came too.
What did you and Brian do once y'all were back at the house?
We stayed up for a very short period of time, but Brian, of course, had a little too much to drink, so 2 beers, and so he went to bed. I went up there with him for a little bit, but they were having a good time, and my son was leaving for Iraq, so I went down and spent a little bit of time with him, with his friends, and they were playing board games and things, so I just left him and went to bed. I wasn't up very long.
Did Brian ever leave the house once you got home?
No. Mm-mm.
Did you leave the house at any point?
Yes, I got we had radios, so I call it a beep beep, but my son asked me to, he wasn't there yet at that point, asked me to meet his friend because he didn't know where we lived, meet him at the little gas station on the corner, and so I drove down there, didn't get out of the car, just drove around, we waved at each other, and he followed me back to Beacons Bend.
How long would you say that trip took to get from your house to the gas station and back?
I don't know, 5 minutes. 5-10 minutes. I mean, it was just right down the road.
That is Karina Schultz Howard, and I want to make sure I say that very carefully and very slowly. She is Brian Howard's wife, and quite the party they were having the night that this murder took place. Marni Jo Snyder, you know, you've got the wife to alibi her husband. We're not sure, but we assume Brian Howard himself will take the stand to alibi himself. Always nice to have corroboration, though. But it just sounds pretty darn good in terms of alibis. Is there such a thing as too good an alibi?
I don't know. I don't think that there is. I think that sometimes the alibis are a little suspect when it's one person with that other person at home, their loved ones. There might be a motive for that person to lie. But 15 people at a party, you know, and she seems to be saying that it had parts of it that were spontaneous, right? Leaving one part, going to a different house, someone going upstairs. But I don't know that it means that this is the person that planned the whole murder through their charging, right? It's alibying someone else from being the person. And you can't do process of elimination of the whole country. So we'll see how it really plays into the guilt phase for this gentleman that's on trial now. You
know, I think what's going to be critical is the Brian Howard testimony, if he indeed testifies, because, you know, he's hanging out there like a big salami. They know that he's being looked at. He was given the pass because the cops felt that alibi was very strong. But the jury, you know, maybe not so quick to point their finger away from Brian Howard. So we'll see if he actually does take the stand. We're going to take a quick break. We'll go back into that courtroom. Very bloody crime scene, and so that became a very important part of this trial. We're going to catch up on that scientific evidence when we come right back to Law&Crime. everybody. Welcome back to Law and Crime Network. We're catching up on the Holbrook case out of Florida. This is a murder case. Death penalty is in play. The crime itself involved bludgeoning, a messy crime. The crime scene, very messy. And to help kind of piece together what was going on, remember the crime took place back in 2006. So what I want you to consider whenever you're hearing scientific evidence of some sort, and we're about to hear from the medical examiner, the forensic pathologist, think about what may have changed, what new information has come along, because some scientific changes, some advancements in the technique for determining what evidence might connect the crime scene to the defendant made a big difference here, because here we are, 13 years later, and we're in this trial for a crime that took place so long ago. So let's go back into the courtroom in the Holbrook case, and this is Dr. Snyder, the forensic pathologist.
And these are the injuries on the neck, of which I did not mention one of them to you, but I will now. There's one right under her jawbone, and it's not perfectly straight. It's actually slightly curved, crescent-shaped. And the top part of it, or the part going back toward the ear or back of the head, actually is skin scraped, and I regarded that as having a contour that could have been made by a fingernail. That was my observation at that time. But in addition to that injury, there are the other two stab wounds and some smaller little skin scrapes on the neck as well. The lower stab wound that I listed as B, and that went through her Adam's apple area, is that straight line right next to my photo card. The first wound that went through her jugular vein is now currently more gaping until I bring it back together, but that was my upper stab wound A.
I'm going to go back one photograph so the jury can see the straight line of what we're looking at right now as compared to the prior photograph.
That's Dr. Snyder talking about the wounds to the victim in this case, Melissa Howard, yeah, it was messy. There was stab wounds, the carotid artery was severed, and there was bludgeoning. Marni, Joe Snyder is with me. You would think in a crime scene of this sort, you're going to have a lot of victim's blood, but with what apparently was a very violent encounter, you got to have something from the defendant you're trying to pin this on, right?
Well, that's what you would hope. Or, as the prosecution, you have to prove, or you want to show, rather, why you don't have those things, right? So what prevented you from having DNA? Was it because it was incredibly premeditated or the person cleaned up, or you have evidence of gloves? They want to kind of show something like that to explain it. Because without that kind of type of conclusive evidence, there's going to be a big problem for the jury convicting someone, especially when it's a death case.
I've mentioned this story before when we've encountered what I call clean crime scenes. There was a case I covered out of Essex County in New Jersey where a woman cut the husband up into pieces in their bathroom, threw his body parts in suitcases, tossed them into the bay in Delaware. Never found a thing there. They took the drains apart. They found nothing. In this case, in the Holbrook case, cops were so impressed with how clean the crime scene was, they originally thought this was a professional killing. But now, here we are, 10 plus years later, there are crazy things like familial DNA around where you can find DNA from a defendant, linking it to a family member and known DNA from that family member. So those are the kinds of advancements that certainly was the downfall in this case of David Russell Holbrook Jr. It may be that connection with his brother Michael. So it's an interesting twist. It's taken longer than the family certainly would have wanted for some sort of justice, but the trial is now currently underway, and we believe we're going to be back in that courtroom very soon. The judge seems to have calmed down. He's been battling with the attorneys over some discovery of sorts in the form of emails that was transferred from the defense to the prosecution in a tardy fashion, according to the judge. So let's roll it back a little bit here to catch you up with what the defense has been putting forth as their position from the very beginning of this case. This is the defense opening statement.
The state has already admitted that they believe there's going to be testimony that shows that Russell was at a birthday party, and there's going to be witnesses that he was there at the birthday party, including his daughter Danielle, his brother Michael, Michael's girlfriend Melissa Soule, and others were all at this birthday party. And at some time around 8:45 that he had to start rounding up people to go bring Danielle and Brian back to their house at Darlene Cooper's house. And that the instructions had been, and the states even in their own opening agreed that he was supposed to be roughly there around 9 o'clock. Now, the state has also stated that there's going to be a phone call that was made by Danielle. That was roughly around 9:24 that night. After she got dropped off, and shortly after being dropped off, she makes a phone call at 9:24 p.m. Shortly after that, there's going to be testimony that another phone call is made at 9:29 from Russell Holbrook to Gina Baker. And I'm not sure we're going to hear what the contents of that statement were, but a statement was made, a call was made at 9:29 to those two individuals for him to pick up some medicine. So Russell and his brother, who was riding with him, go to Walmart. Y'all are going to see a video of Walmart. It's going to have timelines on there of when these individuals went into Walmart and when they left. One video says they arrived at 9:35. One says they arrived at 9:37. What we do know is they left at 9:40. And shortly thereafter returned back home to the birthday party. Left, dropped kids off, went to Walmart, came back home, all wearing the same clothing. No one's frazzled. No one looks any different. There's no blood. There's nothing on these individuals that would indicate that Russell had been in any gruesome murder during that time frame, during this timeline. It's going to be very difficult, I believe. I think the evidence will show it'll be very difficult to have done this so-called murder. Just didn't have the opportunity. There's problems. Not enough time. Just not enough time to have done it.
That is the defense attorney for David Russell Holbrook Jr. and his opening statement. They're laying out, the details that took place. It means his guy couldn't have done it. I'm always surprised at the Walmart surveillance references. I mean, Walmart's becoming as popular and famous for their surveillance as their, 2-for-1 on Charmin. So we're going to get back to the live trial. We have a new witness on the stand, and Megan Palumbo is a detective. She was involved in the wiretaps that took place between the brother and the defendant, and we don't know the quality. So let's go into the courtroom, see if they're sufferable, and find out what's going on with this detective. Well, we were doing pretty well for a while there. The audio was not too bad for these wiretap situations, but then there's a lot of chatter, some sort of background noise made it a little more difficult to pick up. But what it seems clear to me, though, Marni, Joe Snyder, is that the cops have been talking to Michael Holbrook, the brother of the defendant, and saying, hey, we got this on your brother, we got this, we've got new DNA now because there's new testing that they didn't have 10 years ago. This is not a fun conversation for the defendant, especially when it's his brother talking to him.
Yeah, and it's a strange conversation. Sometimes I don't want to give a lot of credence to these wiretap calls because we never know the context. We don't know the way that people have been talking to each other for their whole lives. We don't know kind of, whether they normally sound nervous, whether they normally sound very casual, whether they're faking to try to save face rather than to try to protect themselves from law enforcement. But these are a little strange that is his response to finding out that his DNA is all over someone. He's like saying that he is in the house and not in the house. And I think that's huge because if your DNA is going to be found somewhere, you need to argue it's there for an innocent reason and not because you are the killer. And the fact that he can't kind of figure out what to say to his own brother is a very serious problem for the defense.
Yeah, he's a little defensive. And remember, this is 10 years. This is the fall of 2016. So this is 10 and a half years after the murder. You got to be thinking, if you're the defendant I did it. I got away with it, if in fact he did. So now you get this call from the brother, which makes it sound like they're looking at you hard. And I don't hear the defendant saying, that's insane. I didn't do it. Yeah, I may have spent some time there, because we knew one another. I didn't do it. I don't hear that.
No, I didn't hear that either. And that is concerning. Like I said, it's not necessary. You have the argument both ways, and you can explain it as the defense. But it is very strange that there's not some sort of like outrage or someone must have planted it because they didn't get me the first time around or something like that, that you would think you would hear from him.
Yeah, it sounds not just defensive, but almost like he's thinking in his mind, okay, how could that have happened? What's my excuse? It seems very defensive and calculating at the same time. Marni, Joe, you're going to stick around. We're going to continue with more of the Holbrook case. We hope to be back in the Dooley case soon. If you've been following that this morning, the judge kicked all electronics out, and that includes the streaming feed. So he's shut things down like you shut down your teenager and his phone at about 10:30 at night. So we'll let you know what's going on there and get you back in that courtroom as soon as we can. In the meantime, Florida versus Holbrook is still underway. It is a bludgeoning, slashing case. It is a murder case, a death penalty case. We're going to get back in that courtroom and bring you up to date on the latest true crime stories when we come back to the Law&Crime Network. That is wiretap evidence in the murder case of Melissa Howard. That is the defendant, David Russell Holbrook Jr., and his brother, Michael Holbrook. With me is Marni Jo Snyder in Philly. Can I say Philly? Is that offensive? Is that all right to say, Philly? Marni?
No, we like it.
You're okay with that? Because I'm from San Francisco. If you say Frisco, I might have to come right out of this chair. So I don't want to offend. Let me get your impressions of this. This is a wiretap conversation from November. It's a few months now past those original wiretaps we just heard a few minutes ago, where he seemed to be more defensive. To me, the read I get on this is more explanatory and more incredulous and almost more like, that's nothing, that's nothing. And more than once he said yada, yada, yada. Well, it could be yada, 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 you're going to the death penalty. How do you read these different wiretaps over time?
I find that this one seems less defensive, but it also seems like he really is trying to explain away each piece of evidence because it seems like it's starting to close in. He's now told the police contradictory things, and his brother calls him out right on it. Says, well, you said you've never been to their house, but you described it. Well, is that because it's at nighttime, or what is it that you're talking about? He obviously has to act like he supports him, even though he's taping him. But it sounds like they're really trying to come up with some good explanations here for things that don't actually square away all that nicely. And
it sounds like the cops challenged Michael at one point, the brother, and said, do you always lie for your brother? Apparently there was some sort of alibi that the defendant needed, not related to this murder exactly, but his girlfriend, some sort of excuse he needed to not be where he should have been as it related to his girlfriend. And Michael stepped up, gave him a little fib that helped him out. So the cops are like, well, do you do that often? You lying for him now? How often do you lie for him? So they have a way about getting to the real crux of the issue between these brothers. We're going to get back into that courtroom with more wiretap evidence when we come back to the Law&Crime Network. Wow, that is some critical evidence in this case. This is wiretap from the police of David Russell Holbrook, the defendant, and his brother Michael. And you can hear from Michael, he's basically boiled it down to the nuts and bolts. Hey, they're looking at the two of us like we did this together. And I'm hearing from Russell Holbrook, why would I do that? Why would I go visit her a couple of days before I was going to kill her, if I was going to kill her? I would still expect to see a little more outrage that they're even suggesting he would kill this woman. I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing some very different conversation there. We are going to take a break. The direct examination of this witness, the detective who laid the foundation for those wiretaps, is now done. We'll see what the cross is, if any, when we come right back to the Law&Crime Network.